My husband's secretary was spreading rumors that we were separated and called me a downgrade to his face. So my husband ended her career in the same breath she used to disrespect his marriage. Leanne started working for my husband Keith 3 Januaries ago. She was good at her job for about 2 months and then she decided her real job was replacing me. She brought him coffee every morning even though he told her he only drank water, leaning over a little too far each time. Keith would slide the cup to the corner without looking up and say, "I told you I don't drink coffee, but thanks." He mentioned it at dinner like a boring work detail and said his new secretary must have a memory problem because he told her the same thing every day for 6 weeks. That was Keith. He came home every night at the same time, kissed me at the door, asked about my day before he even put his bag down, and talked about me to his coworkers so much that his business partner once told me, "I feel like I already know your entire life story." Keith didn't notice things like women flirting with him because it genuinely did not register. I'm not saying that to be sweet. The man was physically incapable of recognizing when someone was interested in him. I had to ask him out 3 times before he realized I wasn't just being friendly. So when Leanne started wearing shorter skirts and perfume so strong his partner complained about headaches, Keith came home and said he thought she was going through some kind of phase. I asked if he thought she might be interested in him. He looked at me like I'd suggested the earth was flat. "She's my secretary," he said. "That would be strange." Meanwhile, Leanne was telling the women at the office that Keith and I were having problems. She told the receptionist Keith confided in her about our marriage. She told Keith's partner's wife at a company dinner that Keith seemed emotionally exhausted and that she was worried about him. That got back to me because the wife called me the next day and said, "Is everything okay with you and Keith?" because his secretary made it sound like things were rough. I told Keith. He shrugged and said Leanne probably misread a stressful work week. I wanted to strangle him with love and frustration at the same time. Then she started finding reasons to call him after hours. She'd email at 10 at night and follow up 5 minutes later asking if he'd seen it. Keith responded to everyone because he thought he was being a good boss. He'd sit on the couch next to me answering her emails about filing systems, and I'd stare at the side of his head wondering how a man this smart could be this blind. Then came the company holiday party. I wore a green dress Keith had picked out for me on our anniversary. He held my hand the entire night and introduced me to every person in the building. Leanne showed up in a red dress that looked like it cost 3 months of her salary. She walked straight up to Keith while I was standing right there and said, "You look incredible tonight," without even glancing in my direction. Keith said, "Thanks. Have you met my wife?" and pulled me closer. Leanne looked at me the way you'd look at a stain on a nice tablecloth. She smiled with absolutely nothing behind it and said, "Of course, hi." Then she turned back to Keith and tried to pull him into a back room to go over January projections. Keith said, "It's a party, we'll do it Monday," and walked me to the dance floor. I thought that would be the end of it. It was not. 2 months later, Keith came home and he was different. He didn't kiss me at the door. He put his bag down first. He sat at the dining table and folded his hands and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that I am angrier than I have ever been in my life." He told me his partner had pulled him into his office that afternoon and told him Leanne had been telling clients Keith was separated from his wife. She'd been doing it for months. She told one client's wife she and Keith were not official yet, but getting there. She told another client I had moved out. Keith's jaw was so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He said he went back to his office and asked Leanne if she'd been telling people they were together. She didn't even flinch. She looked at him and said, "It's not like it isn't going to happen eventually. You married down, Keith. Everyone in this office knows it. I'm just helping you get to where you're supposed to be." I asked him what he did. Keith said he didn't yell. He didn't fire her. He didn't say a single word. He stood up, walked past her desk without looking at her, and went straight down the hall to Thomas's office. He closed the door behind him and said, "I need every email, every client note, every message Leanne has sent from her work account in the last year." Thomas didn't even blink. He leaned back in his chair and said, "I've been waiting for you to wake up." Thomas reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a folder. Not a thin one, a real folder, thick, with tabs and dates written on the side. Thomas had been documenting Leanne's behavior for months. He'd been keeping track of things she said, things she did, people she talked to, and he'd been doing it quietly because he knew that one day Keith was going to need proof. Flora, Thomas's wife, had saved screenshots from that company dinner and written down what Leanne said word for word because something about it felt wrong to her. Then Thomas told Keith about Violet, the receptionist. Violet had come to him weeks earlier saying Leanne was telling her Keith had confided in her about feeling stuck and that she was the only person he trusted at work. Violet knew it was a lie because Keith barely talked to Leanne about anything that wasn't directly related to a task. Violet told Thomas she was scared no one would believe her over Leanne, so Thomas wrote it all down and added it to the folder. Then Thomas pulled up the company email system. They started going through Leanne's sent messages from the past year, and that's when it went from bad to something else entirely. Leanne had been emailing clients from her company address using language that made it sound like she and Keith were together, not in a subtle way. One email to a client's assistant said, "Keith and I will be attending the event together. Please arrange seating accordingly." Keith had never invited Leanne to a single client event. There were more like that. Emails where she referred to herself and Keith as "we" when talking about decisions that had nothing to do with her. Emails where she CC'd herself on threads she had no business being on. Keith wanted to fire her that night. Thomas stopped him. "If you fire her now, she'll tell everyone you did it because she rejected you. She'll flip the whole thing. We need to do this the right way so she can't rewrite what happened." So they agreed to bring everything to outside counsel in the morning. Keith finished telling me all of this and I just sat there looking at him. I asked him why he didn't tell me sooner. Keith looked down at his hands and then he looked at me and said, "Because I didn't believe it was real. I thought she was just bad at her job. I didn't want to worry you about something I thought was nothing. And I'm sorry because it wasn't nothing. It was someone disrespecting you for over a year, and I let it happen because I wasn't paying attention." I had seen Keith stressed. I'd seen him tired. I'd seen him frustrated after long days. But I had never, not once in all the years I'd known that man, seen him look ashamed. He looked ashamed sitting at that dining table. His shoulders were down. His voice was low. I reached across the table and put my hand on his. I didn't tell him it was okay because it wasn't. But Keith not seeing it sooner, that part I understood. That was who he was. He saw the best in people until the worst hit him in the face. That night, I barely slept. Keith stayed up in the living room going through printed emails Thomas Thomas had sent him, highlighting lines with a yellow marker like he was preparing for a trial. The next morning, he put on his best suit, kissed me at the door twice, and said, "Today she finds out what happens when you come for my family." Around 10:30, Flora called me. She'd walked past Thomas's office and overheard him on the phone saying something about the handbook not covering it. My stomach turned. I called Keith. He picked up on the second ring and his voice was tight. "The lawyer says if we fire her for this, she could file a wrongful termination claim and say we retaliated against her because she turned me down. She'd lie. She'd say I was the one who came on to her and she rejected me and this is payback." All of that proof. The folder Thomas had been building for months. And none of it mattered because the company handbook didn't have a line that said you can't spread lies about your boss's personal life. The language only covered harassment directed at a coworker, and Leanne could argue what she said was just gossip, just something she said casually that got taken out of context. Her own delusion, the thing that made her dangerous, was now the thing that could protect her, because if she truly believed Keith was interested in her, she could claim she wasn't lying. And if Keith fired her after that, she could spin the whole thing into a story where she was the victim, and he was the man who punished her for not sleeping with him. I leaned against the counter and felt the walls closing in. Then it hit me. I said, "Keith, talk to Violet." He went quiet. "I don't want to drag more people into this." I said, "She already dragged them in. Leanne dragged Violet into this months ago when she started using her as an audience for her lies. We're just asking her to tell the truth about what already happened." Keith finally said, "Okay." An hour later, Keith called me back. His voice was different, almost stunned. He said Violet had sat down across from his desk, and before he could finish his first question, she said, "I've been wanting to tell someone for months, but I was scared she'd get me fired. She told me if I ever repeated what she said, she'd tell you I was the one stealing office supplies and you'd believe her over me." Once Violet started, she couldn't stop. Leanne had been threatening her for weeks. Leanne had told her she had Keith wrapped around her finger and that nobody would pick the receptionist over the boss's future girlfriend. Violet had been walking around that office terrified for months, but that wasn't the part that changed everything. Violet told Keith that Leanne had been telling one of the company's biggest clients that Keith was planning to leave the firm and start a brand new company with Leanne, not gossip about his marriage. She told a client the leadership of the company was about to change because Keith was leaving and taking her with him. Telling a client a partner is leaving is the kind of thing that makes clients pull their business. It's the kind of thing that damages contracts and trust and relationships that took years to build. Keith stood up so fast that Violet flinched. He thanked her, told her no one was going to let Leanne touch her job, and walked straight to the lawyer. He laid it out. The room changed the second those words left his mouth. The lawyer stopped talking about handbook clauses. He sat forward in his chair and said, "That's not gossip. That's fraudulent misrepresentation to clients on behalf of the company. That's a terminable offense and a potential legal claim against her." Thomas looked at Keith, and Keith looked at Thomas. Thomas said, "We got her." Keith said he didn't want to fire her quietly. He didn't want to send her an email or have someone walk her out while she was at lunch. He wanted Leanne to sit in a room with him, with Thomas, with the lawyer, and hear every single lie she told read back to her out loud. He said, "She spent over a year making up a version of reality where I wanted her and my wife didn't matter. I'm going to sit her down and show her the real version." They scheduled a meeting for 3 o'clock. She thought it was about the quarterly review. At about 1:45, my phone buzzed. Flora, one text. Thomas just walked past me with the folder. He looked ready. I read that message 4 times. Thomas had been carrying that folder around for months like a man waiting for a door to open, and now the door was wide open and he was walking through it with everything he had. Then, at 2:45, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something told me to pick up. It was Leanne. Her voice was sweet, smooth, rehearsed. "Hi, I know we've never really talked, but I thought you should hear this from me before someone else tells you. Keith has been coming on to me at work for months. I've been trying to keep it professional, but he won't stop. I'm about to go into a meeting where I think they're going to try to silence me. I just wanted you to know the truth before they spin it." I stood by the sink and I did not move. My heart was going so fast I could feel it in my ears. Every part of me wanted to react. Every part of me wanted to scream into that phone, but I didn't. I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable, and then I said, very quietly, "Is that so?" She thought the silence meant she'd gotten to me. She pushed harder. "I have messages from him. Late night texts. Ask yourself why your husband was texting his secretary at 10 o'clock at night." I almost laughed. I knew exactly why my husband was texting his secretary at 10 o'clock at night. I was sitting right next to him on the couch every single time. I read those messages over his shoulder. Filing cabinets, spreadsheets, calendar invites. That was the big scandalous secret Leanne was trying to use against me. I said, "Leanne, I was sitting on the couch next to him every single time he answered your messages. I read them over his shoulder. I know exactly what they say." 3 full seconds of nothing. Then she said, "You're lying." The sweetness was gone. The control was cracking. I said, "No, you are, and you have been for a very long time. Good luck in your meeting." And I hung up. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from something else. Something that felt a lot like power. I called Keith. I said, "Leanne just called me." His voice went flat. "She called you?" I told him what she'd said. Keith was quiet for a few seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped low and sharp like a blade being pulled from a drawer. "She just made the biggest mistake of her career. That call was from a company phone. Every call from that line is logged and recorded for compliance. She just created her own evidence." I grabbed my keys. I wasn't going to sit at home staring at a clock while Leanne pretended to be the victim. I needed to be in that room, not to yell, not to make a scene. I needed to be sitting across from the woman who called me a downgrade so that she had to look at me while every single lie she told was laid out in front of her. I called Keith back. He said, "The lawyer said it's better if you're not in the room. It keeps it clean." I said, "She picked up a company phone and called your wife. She brought me into this. I'm not asking to speak. I'm asking to be present." Keith put me on hold. A minute later, he came back. "Thomas talked to the lawyer. You can be in the room as a witness to the phone call, not as my wife, as a witness. That's the framing." I said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. I drove in complete silence. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat and the hum of the tires on the road and nothing else. I wasn't nervous. That's the thing that surprised me the most. My hands were steady on the wheel. Violet was at the front desk when I walked in. Her head snapped up and her eyes went wide. Not scared wide. Something else. She leaned forward and whispered, "She's already in there." She walked in 5 minutes ago looking like she owned the place. I walked past her down the hallway. The conference room had a glass panel beside the door. Leanne was sitting at the long table, scrolling through her phone like she was waiting for a coffee order. She looked bored. Thomas was at the far end of the table with the folder in front of him. The lawyer was to his right, laptop open. Keith was standing by the window looking out at the parking lot. I knocked. One knock. Firm. Keith opened the door and gave me a small nod. I walked in. Leanne looked up, and her face went completely blank. Like her brain had received a piece of information it had no file for. She stared for 2 seconds, and then her mouth opened and she said, "What is she doing here?" She didn't say my name. She said she. Like I was an object that had been placed in the wrong room. Keith pulled out a chair for me directly across from her. He sat down across from Leanne and folded his hands. "She's here because you called her 45 minutes ago and told her I was harassing you. So she's here as a witness. Do you want to tell the room what you said on that call, or should we play the recording?" Leanne's composure cracked. Her eyes darted to Thomas, then the lawyer, then Keith. She lifted her chin and said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I never called anyone." The words came out smooth, but her fingers were pressing into the table hard enough to turn the tips white. The lawyer turned his laptop so the screen faced Leanne and pressed play. Leanne's own voice filled the room. Clear, recorded, undeniable. "Keith has been coming on to me at work for months." It played for about 30 seconds. Leanne's face went red, the kind of red that starts at the neck and crawls up. She didn't move. She didn't blink. The recording stopped. Keith said, "Now let's talk about everything else." He opened the folder. The stack of papers made a solid thump. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, and I did not look away from Leanne's face. Not once. She had spent over a year trying to erase me from my own marriage. She told strangers I was gone. She told my husband I was beneath him. She called me a downgrade and smiled while she did it like she was doing him a favor. And now she was sitting in a room with nowhere to go and a folder full of her own words staring back at her. Keith pulled out the first email and read it word for word. "Keith and I will be attending the event together. Please arrange seating accordingly." He set it down in front of her. She didn't touch it. He pulled out the second, then the third. Leanne calling herself part of the leadership transition team. A team that did not exist. He read it out loud, then the fourth. The pile grew. After the fourth one, Leanne broke. "Those were just poor word choices. I was being efficient. I didn't mean anything by them." The lawyer didn't look up. "Misrepresenting company leadership to clients is not a word choice issue. It's a liability issue." Leanne closed her mouth. Then Thomas took over. He read Violet's statements in a voice that was low and even and completely without emotion. He read what Leanne had told Violet about Keith confiding in her. He read what Leanne had told a major client about Keith leaving the company. Leanne shook her head but said nothing. Then Thomas read Flora's notes. Flora hadn't just remembered what Leanne said at that company dinner. Flora had written down the exact date. She'd written down which table they were sitting at. She'd written down the exact words Leanne used because something about that conversation had felt wrong to her. It was all right there in black and white. The date, the table, the words. There was no room to call it a misunderstanding. Leanne looked at me for the first time since the recording played. There was anger in her eyes. Cornered anger. I looked right back. I didn't blink. Then she stood up. She put both hands on the table and leaned forward and looked directly at Keith. Her voice was shaking but loud. "You led me on. You answered every text. You replied to every email. You smiled at me every morning. A man doesn't do that unless he's interested. You gave me signals." The room went still. Keith didn't blink. He let her finish. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled and started reading, out loud, from his text thread with her. The first message was a meeting time. The second was a document request. The third was a calendar confirmation. He read 12 total. Everyone was about work. Not one personal word, not one emoji, not one joke. He set the phone down. "You sent me a text about a filing system at 10:15 at night. I responded because I thought it was urgent. My wife was sitting right next to me. She read it over my shoulder and said, 'Your secretary has the worst timing of anyone alive. That's the closest thing to a signal you ever got from me.' And it wasn't from me. It was from her." He turned and looked at me. I met his eyes, then back at her. "I never led you on. I was polite, I was professional, and you took that and built a fantasy so real you tried to burn down my marriage to make it true." Leanne sat back down slowly. Her hands were shaking. The lawyer slid a document in front of her. A termination agreement with a non-disparagement clause. Sign and walk away with her last check. Refuse and face a legal claim for the business damage she had caused. She stared at it for a long time. Then she picked up the pen. She looked at me one more time. I gave her nothing. My face was still. My eyes were steady. I just looked at her the way you look at something that is already over and you both know it. She signed her name, stood up, picked up her purse, and walked toward the door. She was 3 steps from the door when Keith spoke. "Leanne." She stopped. She didn't turn around. Keith said, "That woman you called a downgrade is the reason I come home every single night. She's the reason I'm still sitting here being calm instead of letting Thomas file every claim he's been holding back for 6 months. You should thank her on your way out." Leanne didn't turn around. She didn't say a word. She walked through the door and it clicked shut behind her. That night, Keith came home on time. He kissed me before he set his bag down. He didn't say her name. The dog slept on the rug.